In this video, I want to give you a complete introduction to the piano and music theory, from the layout of the keyboard to intervals, chords, music notation, hand movement, down to the sustain pedal. If you stick around until the end, you'll get some bonus tips for daily practice. Here's an overview of the topics we'll talk about. There's some logic behind this order. The chapters build on each other to some degree, but of course, feel free to jump to any section you find interesting. Finally, I recommend watching this video while sitting at the piano, so you can try things out as we go. Alright, enough talk, let's begin. A standard piano has 88 keys, and each key produces a specific tone, from the lowest note on the left to the highest note on the right. Other than their pitch, there's no difference in quality between them. White keys, black keys, they're all equally important. You can imagine all of the notes as a ladder or staircase, going upward from left to right. The first important thing to understand is that this staircase is built out of identical steps. So between any two neighboring keys, such as these two white keys, or this white key and the black key next to it, we always have the same musical distance or interval. This interval is called a semitone. Since a semitone is the smallest step in our musical system, we can use it as a unit of measurement for the distance between any two notes. For example, to get from this key to this one, we need to climb 4 semitones on our musical staircase. The next important thing to notice is that the keys are arranged in a repeating pattern of 7 white and 5 black keys. Thanks to this structure, we can easily identify each key by its position in this layout. For example, the white key on the left side of the 2 black keys is a C. This is true across the entire keyboard. So this is a C, and this is a C, and this is a C. There are a total of 8 Cs on a standard piano. The one that's more or less in the middle of our keyboard is called middle C. All of these Cs share the same name because when you play 2 of them together, they sound so similar that we perceive them as higher or lower versions of the same note. Of course, this is true for all other keys as well. The white key to the right of each C is also considered the same note across the whole keyboard. If we count the steps between 2 Cs, we'll find that they are 12 semitones apart. This interval, the distance between 2 notes with the same name, is called an octave. So between 2 Cs, within each octave, we find 12 different notes. And these are the 12 notes we use in Western music. Good news, the musical alphabet is really easy. We simply use the first 7 letters of the alphabet. On the piano, we use these 7 letters to name the 7 white keys in each octave. Since we already know that this key is a C, we can place the letters accordingly. This system just repeats across the whole keyboard. And now you can already figure out the name of every single white key on the piano. At first, you might need to count from C to figure out the other keys. But with a little practice, I think you'll be surprised how quickly you start recognizing each key immediately. And here's even more good news. You don't have to learn any additional letters for the black keys, because they don't actually have their own letters. They're simply named after the white keys next to them. For this purpose, we use 2 musical symbols, so-called accidentals. A sharp raises a note by a semitone, while a flat lowers it by a semitone. So this black key can be called C sharp because it's a semitone above C, and it can also be called D flat because it's a semitone below D. This is true for all black keys. Each one sits between two white keys and can be named after either one, depending on the musical context. This might seem a little confusing now, but don't worry, we'll understand later on why this system makes sense. A scale is simply a specific sequence of notes. Of course, we can create a scale with all 12 notes we find in each octave. That's called a chromatic scale. But usually we use scales with a smaller amount of notes. The two most important scales we use in Western music, the major and minor scale, are so-called diatonic scales, which consist of 7 notes. This is why the piano has 7 white keys in each octave. And it's also why our musical alphabet has 7 letters. Each letter appears exactly once in any major or minor scale. Using just the white keys on the piano, we can already play both a major and a minor scale. If we begin on C, that's a C major scale. If we begin on A, we play an A minor scale. It is often said that major and minor have different emotional qualities. Major keys tend to sound bright and uplifting, while minor keys sound a little darker and sadder. In any case, the vast majority of Western music, from classical to pop, is based on these scales. So when you hear that a song is in a specific key, such as C major or A minor, it means that the first note of that scale is the tonal center, and the song mostly uses notes and chords from that specific scale. We'll take a closer look at the structure of major and minor scales in Chapter 5. As we learned in Chapter 1, an interval is the musical distance between two notes. We've already talked about two specific intervals. A semitone is the smallest step in our musical system. An octave is the distance between two notes with the same name. Now, we also need names for all the other intervals in between. Conveniently, they are derived from our 7-note scales. So let's take another look at the C major scale. Our scale begins on C. The second note of our scale is D. So the interval from C to D is called a second. The interval from C to E is called a third. Then the fourth, fifth, sixth, seventh, and finally the octave. Easy, right? Of course, we also want to name the distance between C and the black keys. And this is where things get a little more complicated. First of all, there are 4 intervals in our major scale that are called perfect intervals, because they produce the most consonant sounds. The first one is the interval between the root note and itself. The idea is that if the distance between two notes is 0, meaning you play the same note twice, or the same note is played by different instruments, that's the most consonant sound there is, because it's the same note. We call this perfect unison. The second most consonant interval is the octave, which we also perceive as the same note, just at a different pitch. After that, we have the perfect fifth and the perfect fourth. The fourth and the fifth play a very important role in music theory, as we will see in later chapters. The remaining 4 notes of our scale are considered less consonant, so they are not perfect intervals. Instead, each one of them exists in 2 different sizes, called major and minor. Our C major scale happens to contain the major versions of these intervals. So here we have a major second, major third, major sixth, and major 7th. The minor intervals are each one semitone smaller than their major siblings, so this is how we get to the black keys. The black key, a semitone below the major 2nd, is the minor 2nd. Below the major 3rd, we have the minor 3rd. The same is true for the minor 6th and the minor 7th. Now, there's one key we haven't named yet, the note between the perfect 4th and the perfect 5th. This interval is called a tritone. It's considered the most dissonant interval in Western music and was even nicknamed the devil in music in medieval times. Now that we have names for all 12 intervals, let's arrange them by their distance in semitones. A distance of one semitone is called a minor 2nd, or halftone. The next interval, 2 semitones, is called a major 2nd, or whole tone. Then we have the minor 3rd and the major 3rd, the perfect 4th, the tritone, sometimes called augmented 4th or diminished 5th, the perfect 5th, the minor 6th, major 6th, the minor 7th, and major 7th. And last but not least, the octave. With this information, we can figure out any interval from any starting point. For example, if we want to find a major 3rd above F, we simply count 4 semitones and land on A. If we want a perfect 4th above F, we need to go one semitone further, which takes us to A sharp or B flat. With just the white keys, we can play a C major scale and an A minor scale. Of course, to play in any other key, we'll have to use the black keys as well. But how do we know which keys to use in which scale? Thanks to our new knowledge about intervals, we can take a look at the structure of major and minor scales. The major scale contains 3 perfect intervals, 4th, 5th, and the octave, as well as 4 major intervals, the 2nd, 3rd, 6th, and 7th. Now let's compare that to our minor scale. The perfect intervals remain the same. We have a perfect 4th from A to D, a perfect 5th from A to E, and of course an octave from A to A. The second note of our scale also remains the same. There are 2 semitones between A and B, a major 2nd. However, the third note of the scale is lower than the one in our major scale. There's only a minor 3rd between A and C. The same is true for the 6th and 7th. Both of them are minor intervals. So that's the whole difference between major and minor keys. In the minor scale, the 3rd, 6th, and 7th note are each a semitone lower compared to the major scale. This means that if we want to turn our C major scale into a C minor scale, all we have to do is lower these 3 notes by a semitone. So a C minor scale looks like this. Likewise, we can transform our A minor scale into major by raising these 3 notes. I want to show you one more way to think about this, and it's connected to the layout of the keys on the piano. We learned that there's always a semitone between neighboring keys. This means that although the white keys are identical in size, there are actually 2 different intervals between them, since there's no black key between E and F and between B and C. Those notes are only a semitone apart, while we have 2 semitones, a whole tone, between all the other white keys. So when we play a scale using just the white keys, Each octave consists of 5 whole tones and 2 semitones. This is true for both our major and our minor scale. The only difference between them is the position of the 2 semitones. In our major scale, we have semitones between the notes 3 and 4 and 7 and 8. In our minor scale, the semitones are between 2 and 3 and 5 and 6. The great thing is, you don't have to memorize any of this, because as soon as you're sitting at the piano, you have this structure right in front of you. All you need to remember is that when you play a scale using the white keys, the major scale begins on C and the minor scale begins on A. So with this formula, we can now create any major or minor scale. Just to give an example, let's build a D major scale. The first step is a whole tone, which takes us from D to E. Now we need another whole tone. Since E and F are only a semitone apart, our third note has to be F sharp. The next step in our scale is a semitone, so we move from F sharp to G. The following 3 steps are whole tones, so we go from G to A, from A to B, and from B to C sharp. That leaves us with the final step of our scale, a semitone between C sharp and D. The fifth is a very important interval in music theory. It's the most consonant interval after the octave, and it's the foundation of our harmonic system. If you start on the lowest C on the piano and go up a fifth, then another, and so on, this chain of fifth will lead you through all 12 notes of the chromatic scale before arriving back at C. This pattern allows us to visualize all 12 notes as a circle of fifth. Now, this circle is one of the greatest tools in all of music theory, because it's a complete guide through all major and minor keys and the sharps and flats we need for each scale. It works like this. At the top, we have the key of C major, which only uses the white keys. If we move clockwise, we enter the world of sharps, and with each step, we add 1 sharp to our scales. So the G major scale has 1 sharp. The D major scale has 2 sharps. The A major scale has 3, and so on. But how do we know where to put the sharps in each key? That's easy as well. We simply add the sharps in the same order they appear in our clockwise circle. The first sharp note we come across is F sharp. So that's the sharp note we need in the key of G major. The next key, D major, keeps the F sharp and adds a C sharp. In the key of A major, we add a G sharp, and so on. So once you're familiar with this visual system, all it takes is a quick glance at the circle to know that a D major scale looks like this. Now let's play the same game counterclockwise. As you might have guessed, this time we're in a world of flats. So the key of F major has 1 flat, B flat major has 2 flats, and so on. Just like before, we add the flat notes in their order of appearance. So the flat note in F major is a B flat, and in the key of B flat major, we add an E flat. In summary, the full circle of all 12 major keys looks like this. But what about the minor keys? Well, we already discovered that the C major and A minor scales use the exact same notes, just from different starting points. This is true for all the other scales as well. Each major key has a so-called relative minor, that uses the same sharps or flats. For this purpose, the circle of fifth has an inner ring, which shows these relative minor keys. So, if you're learning a piece and the key signature shows 3 flats, the circle of fifth tells you right away that this piece is either in E flat major or C minor. A chord is simply a combination of notes played together that produce a certain harmony. The most basic type of chord is a triad, which consists of 3 notes. Naturally, in our musical world of major and minor scales, we also have major and minor triads. An easy way to build such a chord is to combine the first, third, and fifth note of any major or minor scale. For example, in the C major scale, if we play C, E, and G, we get a C major chord. If we use the same method in the A minor scale, we get an A minor chord. In the most common system of chord notation, a capital letter represents a major chord, and we indicate a minor chord by adding a lowercase m. So, what's the difference between a major and a minor chord? Let's take a look at the intervals they use. In our C major chord, we have 4 semitones between C and E, and 3 semitones between E and G. So, from our root note, we go up a major third to E, and then a minor third to G. In our A minor chord, we use the same 2 intervals, but in reverse. We begin with 3 semitones, a minor third between A and C, followed by 4 semitones, a major third between C and E. So both major and minor chords contain a major third and a minor third, just in a different order. This difference in structure is the entire secret behind major and minor chords. Here's another way to look at it. In both chords, the outer notes have the same distance, a perfect fifth, and only the middle note changes. In the minor chord, it's a semitone lower. So, if we want to turn our C major chord into a C minor chord, all we have to do is lower the third from E to E flat. Likewise, we can transform our A minor chord into an A major chord by simply raising the middle note from C to C sharp. With this formula, you can now build any major or minor chord. So why don't you try to figure out the following chords yourself? Before we close this chapter, there's one more thing I want to mention. In reality, you will often come across chord inversions. That simply means that the notes of the chord have been put in a different order. For example, we learned that a C major chord contains C, E, and G. Now we can rearrange these notes so that our chord begins with E or with G. These are still C major chords because they contain the same 3 notes, but only the first one begins with C. So whenever you're trying to identify a chord by its root note, just keep in mind that this only works if the chord is in its root position. A chord progression is simply a sequence of different chords. Most of the music we listen to is based on specific harmonies, appearing in a certain order. Usually, the combination of melody and chords is enough to capture the essence of a song. For its duration, each chord defines the harmonic space for this specific part of the song. Of course, the chords that appear in a piece of music are not chosen randomly. In one way or another, they are related to the song's root note or key. To understand this, let's take a look at the chords that appear naturally in our C major scale. Since our scale consists of 7 notes, we can build 7 different chords, and we use Roman numerals to indicate their harmonic functions. Of course, the first chord in our C major scale is the C major chord, which is our tonal center. If we move upwards, we land on the D minor chord. For minor chords, we use lowercase Roman numerals. The next chord is an E minor chord. After that, we have 2 major chords, F major and G major, followed by an A minor chord. The final chord does not only sound a little strange, it also has a different structure than all the others. As we learned in the previous chapter, each minor and major chord is built out of 2 different intervals, a major and a minor third. However, this chord consists of 2 identical intervals, 2 minor thirds. This means that the interval between the outer notes is not a perfect fifth, but a tritone or diminished fifth. We call such a chord a diminished chord, which is indicated by a degree symbol. So, in every major scale, we can use our 7 notes to play these 7 chords. Unsurprisingly, the 3 major chords play a very important role. They are known as the tonic, the dominant, and the subdominant. They are so essential to Western music that if you pick a random pop song, it's very likely that all 3 of them will appear in it. They are also all you need for a standard 12-bar blues. Let's use them for a simple chord progression. In C major, that means we need to play the following chords. If we use chord inversions and add a bass note, it could sound like this. Now let's change the order a bit and throw in one of our minor chords. With a little practice, this chord progression could sound like this. Sounds familiar? That's because this chord progression is used in countless popular songs. Music notation can seem intimidating at first, but once you understand a few basics, it becomes an incredibly helpful system, and it opens up a whole new world of musical possibilities. So here's how it works. A set of 5 horizontal lines is called a staff. Notes can be placed on the lines or in the spaces between them. The range of our staff can be extended with the help of ledger lines. A higher position on the staff represents a higher pitch. So if we want to write a scale going up, we simply add a sequence of notes from left to right, each one higher than the last. For piano notation, we don't use 1 staff but 2, a so-called grand staff. The upper staff contains the notes for the right hand and the lower staff for the left hand. To indicate that they represent different regions of the keyboard, we use musical clefs, the treble clef and the bass clef. These symbols tell us how to interpret the note positions in each staff. This means that even though 2 notes might look the same, they represent different notes on the keyboard, depending on the clef. This might be a little confusing at first, but there's a simple way to connect the 2 clefs. They meet at middle C. In the bass clef, middle C is placed on the first ledger line above the staff. In the treble clef, middle C is on the first line below the staff. So we can use middle C as a point of orientation to figure out any note in our system. The next important thing to understand is that this system of music notation directly corresponds to the layout of the piano keyboard. Without any sharps or flats, the notes in each staff correspond to the white keys on the piano. So if we write a scale beginning on C, using every possible placement in our staff, between the lines, on the line, between the lines, and so on, that's a C major scale. Of course, it works the same way in the bass clef. Now, in order to use the black keys, we can place a sharp or flat symbol in front of a note. Let's write a D major scale. Since we know that this is middle C, going up one step in our notation system takes us to the next white key. Going up another step takes us to E, followed by F. Now we simply place a sharp symbol in front of the F to turn it into F sharp. And then we have G, A, B, C sharp before we get back to D. Now, if a piece of music is in the key of D major, of course it would be kind of redundant to place sharp symbols in front of every single C and F. To simplify this, we use key signatures, a set of sharps or flats placed at the beginning of each staff, right after the clef. These key signatures tell us which notes are sharp or flat throughout the whole piece. So if a song is in D major, it will have two sharps in its key signature. But what if you want to use a C in this piece, despite the key signature telling us that every C should be a C sharp? For this purpose, we place a natural symbol in front of the note. This symbol tells us that we need to read this note without any sharps or flats, turning it back to a white key. Music takes place in the dimension of time, so we need to be able to define not only the pitch, but also the duration of each note. For this purpose, we use different note symbols that indicate their length. This is a whole note. It can be split into 2 half notes, 4 quarter notes, 8 eighth notes, 16 16th notes, and so on. Now, this system tells us the length of each note in relation to the other notes, but it doesn't actually give us an actual time for any of them. The reason is that their duration depends on the speed, the so-called tempo of a piece of music. Sometimes sheet music will include a precise tempo, such as quarter note equals 60 beats per minute. So in this case, each quarter note would be 1 second long. In a different piece, quarter notes might be defined as 120 beats per minute, so you would need to play them twice as fast. In classical music, tempo is usually indicated by Italian terms, such as adagio, moderato, or allegro, which tells you more about how the piece should feel instead of a precise number of beats per minute. Now, in music notation, it's not only the individual note that has a certain length. Every piece of music is divided into bars, separated by bar lines. These bars, or measures, are equal segments of time that help us understand the rhythmic structure of a piece of music. Let's take a typical waltz rhythm as an example. It's very easy to hear that there's a repeating pattern of 3 beats. So it makes a lot of sense to organize this piece of music into bars of that length. At the beginning of every piece, there's a time signature which tells you about its rhythmic structure. The top number gives us the number of beats in each bar, and the bottom number tells us which note length corresponds to 1 beat. So in this case, the time signature informs us that each bar has a length of 3 quarter notes. The most common time signature, which is used for the vast majority of popular music, is 4/4, meaning each bar has 4 beats, and each beat is a quarter note. In fact, 4/4 is so common that it is often replaced by the C symbol, which stands for common time. Now, although music is generally perceived to be more about emotions than numbers, the length of each bar is strictly defined. If our time signature tells us that there are 4 quarters in each bar, that has to be fulfilled. The only exception is that at the very beginning of a piece, there can be an incomplete bar, such as a single note before the first bar line. But after that, each bar has to contain the exact amount of beats that are indicated in the time signature. Nothing more, nothing less. So, in the 4/4 time signature, we could fill a bar with 4 quarters, or 2 half notes, or 2 quarters and a half note, or 1 whole note. However, in a 3/4 time signature, there can never be a whole note in a bar, because it's too long. On the other hand, if we put only a half note in a bar, it's incomplete. There's a quarter note missing. Of course, sometimes we want a break within a melody, or a moment of silence between chords. That's why each note has a corresponding rest, which indicates silence for that same duration. So, in our example, instead of adding a quarter note after our half note, we could also add a quarter rest to complete the bar. So, let's put this into practice and play a short segment together. First of all, you need to find a sitting position that allows you to sit upright and place your hands on the keys with a straight wrist, not bent upwards or downwards. Think of your hands as an extension of your arms. It is important that you're able to move your hands back and forth over the keys without getting stiff or cramped. Generally, you want your fingers, your hands, and your wrists to be relaxed. So every time you feel any tension or pain during practice, simply lift your hands to relax them. Maybe even shake them a little bit to loosen up. If you put your hands down now, they are in a relaxed and natural position, with rounded fingers and the wrist that's able to move. Your hands should never feel like machines doing hard work. You want them to move as elegantly as a cat that barely seems to touch the ground. Basically, you want to allow your fingers to be as lazy as possible and to play with very little force and effort. So instead of playing like this, aim for this. Even when you want to play loudly, never use brute force. Your hand can be powerful and relaxed at the same time. Now, the reason why it is often recommended to practice scales is that they help you apply many important principles. Let's take a D major scale as an example. We'll begin with our right thumb on D, and then play E with our index finger. Now we notice that in order to play F sharp with our middle finger in a comfortable position, we need to move our hand further into the keyboard. We want to avoid any sudden movements, so while we play the first 2 notes, we already need to make sure that our middle finger is in the right position to play the black key without any awkward movements. After that, we could use the remaining 2 fingers to play G and A. However, now we run into a problem, because our scale doesn't end there. So, in order to continue, we would need to jump up with our hand, or turn our hand in some awkward way. Of course, there's a better solution. While our middle finger is on F sharp, we can move our thumb below the other fingers to the next key, often called a thumb tuck. Then, while you press this key with your thumb, your whole hand can move up and return to its natural, relaxed position, which allows you to play the remaining notes of our scale very comfortably. Once we've reached the top D, we can do the same thing in reverse. We play down until we reach the thumb. Then we move our middle finger above the thumb to play F sharp and get our hand back towards its natural position for the remaining two notes. Let's do the whole thing one more time. If we perform another thumb tuck after the second black key, we can even extend our scale over 2 octaves. To show which finger should play which key, we can add fingering numbers to the music notation. In this system, the fingers on each hand are numbered from 1 to 5, beginning with the thumb. The idea is to write these numbers on top of a note whenever the hand position wouldn't be clear, or whenever a change in position takes place. So, in our example of the D major scale, we would write a 1 above the first D, telling us that we play this note with our thumb, and another 1 above G, telling us to perform a thumb tuck when we play the F sharp. Let's play a D major scale with the left hand and follow the fingering instructions on the page. Sometimes sheet music comes with fingering numbers, which can be very helpful. However, when you begin learning a piece, it can actually be a really useful process to figure out your own fingering. It forces you to consciously look at the piece step by step and find the most ergonomic way to play it for your hands. Of course, playing scales might not be the most musically interesting thing to do. However, it's not only a great exercise for improving your hand movement, it's also a fantastic way to get familiar with the sharps and flats in all keys. When you're playing piano, most of the magic is happening in your fingers. But your feet play a role as well, especially your right foot, which is controlling the sustain pedal. On a real instrument, you might find 2 or 3 pedals. The sustain pedal is always on the right. As the name suggests, this pedal sustains the sound. Without it, each key produces a sound just while it is pressed. As soon as I lift the key, the sound stops. But once I push down the sustain pedal, the sound becomes independent of how long I hold a note with my finger. I can hit a key very shortly, and yet the sound continues until I lift the sustain pedal. This is really useful because quite often you want a certain sound to continue, but you can't hold the keys with your fingers because they need to play other notes or because your hand needs to change its position. Let's take the waltz pattern we used earlier as an example. In this case, the left hand is required to jump between the bass note and the chords. Without the sustain pedal, this means the bass note and the chords won't be heard together, and there will be audible gaps between them. Now listen to how different this sounds when I use the sustain pedal. So the sustain pedal can really change the character of a piece and create a much softer, rounder, fuller sound. Here's another example, first without, then with the sustain pedal. Quite a difference, right? But how exactly do we use it? Usually, we can't push down the sustain pedal at the beginning of a piece and keep it down until the last note, because not all notes go well together. For example, if I hold the pedal and play a series of different chords, this will create a very dissonant sound. That's why we need to pay attention to harmonic changes. Whenever a piece enters a new harmony, which could be indicated by a chord symbol or a new bass note, it makes sense to lift the sustain pedal to let go of the old sounds and then push it down again for the new harmony. In many cases, harmonic changes happen from one bar to another, so as a rule of thumb, it often makes sense to lift and hold the sustain pedal for each bar. The more experience you have, the more you will learn to trust your ears. Now, what makes this a little tricky at first is the right timing of your foot's movement. It's likely that your initial impulse will be to move the sustain pedal in a parallel motion to your hand. For example, if you play two different chords, you might push the sustain pedal down together with the chord, then release both of them at the same time, and do the same thing for the next chord. However, we want to use the sustain pedal to bridge the gap between sounds while we move our hand. So when I lift my hand from the first chord, I want to keep holding the sustain pedal until I play the next chord. The same moment I play the second chord, I lift the pedal and push it right back down to enable my hand to move again. So my foot performs some kind of contrary motion to my hand. When my hand goes down, my foot goes up. Then the foot goes back down again, so I can lift my hand. Of course, the faster you perform the pedal release, the more flexible you'll be on the keyboard. So a very typical motion pattern for our foot would be that it spends most of the time holding down the pedal, interrupted by very short releases. A great way to practice this is to play different chords and perform this quick movement with your foot whenever you press the keys with your hand. You could also play a pattern with your left hand, jumping between a bass note and a chord, and change the sustain pedal with every bass note. It's a bit like learning to drive. It takes a lot of concentration in the beginning, but soon your foot will just move automatically. Alright, last but not least, I've got a few bonus tips for you. Number 1, choose the right songs. Of course, you want to pick songs that you like, so you're motivated to learn them. But you also want to pay attention to their difficulty. There's nothing wrong with a challenge, but if you spend hours practicing just a few bars without much progress, maybe pick a different piece for now. For many songs you can find dozens of different arrangements, so it's worth doing a little research and finding a version that works for you. Number 2, build a routine. If you want to improve, think about how to make piano practice part of your daily life. It can be very helpful to have a consistent practice schedule, or to set goals like practicing for at least 10 minutes a day, or mastering a certain song by the end of next week. Number 3, practice slowly. This might be the most important piece of advice I have. When you sit down to practice, try not to play the piece from start to finish. A lot of people do that, and I've been guilty of it myself, but you'll just keep making the same mistakes. Instead, focus on the tricky spots and repeat them very slowly. Once you can play a part accurately at a low speed, increasing the tempo is pretty easy. But if mistakes are locked into your muscle memory, that's much harder to change. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this, you can find more videos on music theory on my channel. I hope you found this helpful, and I wish you all the best on your very own musical journey.